Hello and welcome to Accounting 4200, Government and Not-for-Profit Accounting and Reporting. This is the introductory lesson. We're going to be going over some basic concepts that are going to be important as we lay the foundation for actually understanding how to do accounting in the government sector. So again, this is supposed to go along with your reading in Chapter 1. And so first, we need to be able to understand that there is a difference between the financial reporting for non-business entities and those that we would consider to be business entities. I don't exactly like that term, non-business entities. What I'd rather call them is we've got for-profit businesses, we've got government, and we have not-for-profit businesses. All these organizations, all three different types, are businesses. It's just they don't all operate to earn a profit or a return on investment, at least in the traditional sense. So we want to contrast the chief goals of the private, for-profit, the government, and the not-for-profit organizations. So the highest goal for a private business is to earn a return on the investment for owners or shareholders. All other goals and objectives are subordinate to that goal. One can argue about the timing and the magnitude of the return, but make no mistake in your understanding of the profit motive. The highest goal of government, on the other hand, is what I would like to call happiness. You might frown a little bit, or you might shrug your shoulders, or you might say, well, what does he mean by that? Well, the best way I can explain this is to actually use the words of one of our founding fathers, John Adams, who wrote, "Upon this point, all speculative politicians will agree that the happiness of society is the end of government, as all divines and moral philosophers will agree that the happiness of the individual is the end of man. From this principle, it will follow that the form of government which communicates ease, comfort, security to the greatest number of persons and in the greatest degree is the best." So we have the introduction of this idea of happiness being the chief goal of government, and that in defining happiness, he frames it in terms of ease, comfort, and security. Further in his writing, he goes on to describe or define happiness in terms of virtue. And the quote that I like is, "All sober inquiries after truth, ancient and modern, pagan and Christian, have declared that the happiness of man, as well as his dignity, consists in virtue." So here we have happiness being tied to virtue. And again, that's the chief end of man and the chief goal of government. Okay, so it's very different from what we are used to hearing in our business classes when we're talking about for-profit businesses. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, if I can remind you of that from your political science class, the Declaration of Independence declares the unalienable rights as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So again, the goal here is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we connect that to the formation or the institution of governments. Now, the chief goal of a not-for-profit similarly focuses on achieving a mission. It's not a profit motive. It's not a return on investment in the traditional sense where we're trying to increase the value of someone's monetary investment in a business. So here what we're going to do is we're going to tie the mission to the cause for which something was founded. And so a not-for-profit, the founders of a not-for-profit, form these organizations for a purpose, for a cause. So they may want to raise money and provide scholarships. They may want to find a cure for cancer. They may want to create a foundation to raise money for, say, children's care in a hospital. Any number of issues that people can come up with that they will form nonprofits for. It could be a foundation or a nonprofit that is going to pursue maybe a policy issue such as gun violence. Okay, so any number of issues could come up, and so there'll be some overarching mission for that nonprofit, and that's what their chief aim, their chief goal is to achieve, is whatever that mission is related to that cause. So, given these different chief goals, the purpose of accounting and reporting is going to differ. Now, I want you to be able to distinguish between private and public sector organizations. First of all, we've got two different types of private organizations. The first type that we're familiar with are the for-profits, the private commercial businesses. We can refer to these as issuing and non-issuing, meaning non-issuing are the private businesses that do not publicly sell their stock. The issuing companies are the ones we see listed on the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange, and that people are investing in and building portfolios around, that are included in mutual fund portfolios. And so those are the private businesses. There's also a group of private nonprofit organizations. On the public side, we have governments, and we have federal, state, and local. Within local, there's a variety of local governments. You've got county governments, which are different than municipalities, which includes cities, villages, towns. We also have what we call special purpose entities, which could include things like school districts, utilities, fire districts, water districts, all kinds of different districts that are created with some public purpose in mind. And then finally, we have public not-for-profits. And public not-for-profits generally work hand in hand with government. And so a nonprofit may be formed to deliver some services to a community, doing that based on grants and contracts that they have with the government itself. And so those are the different types of organization. Accounting serves to document whatever the chief mission or goal is. We want to be able to kind of track performance to achieving some goal. So for a private enterprise that's a profit-making business, accounting serves to document the results of that business's activities that are focused on generating a return, profit, or net income. Accounting in government and non-for-profit is focused on accountability and transparency rather than on that profit motive. And accounting for private nonprofits, again, is focused on cause tied to mission. And then in the public nonprofits, it's usually tied to the delivery of some service that they're doing on behalf of the government. So accounting information does not adequately document the performance of government and nonprofit or not-for-profit organizations in relation to their chief goals. And so there has to be something to supplement the accounting system, because where we have a balance sheet and an income statement and a cash flow statement in a private for-profit business, and we can use that to evaluate the performance of the company, we can't necessarily look at the financial statements of a government or of a not-for-profit and be able to determine how well they performed in a period. It really goes more to the heart of the accountability of the use of resources, but it has to be teamed up with something of a non-accounting nature that is geared towards whatever the mission is of that particular organization. So that becomes very, very important. Now, identifying the sources of authoritative accounting standards. Now, we learned in financial accounting that for profit-making businesses, issuing and non-issuing, they're going to follow the Financial Accounting Standard Board, the FASB. That is their generally accepted accounting principles. In the federal government, there's some different groups. There's the federal government follows the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board. That is something that is really foreign to most accounting students. You don't really spend much time talking about the federal government. We're not going to be covering that chapter, but I am going to talk a little bit about it at some point during our brief stay together over the next 5 weeks, just so that you're familiar with it. But this affects the federal government and all the agencies of the federal government. For state and local government, there's a group, kind of a cousin group to the FASB called the Government Accounting Standards Board, or GASB. They have the standards that make up GAAP for state and local governments. Now, the not-for-profits, they're divided again into private and public. The private firms are going to follow FASB, that's tied to the private sector. The not-for-profits on the public side are going to follow GASB. Okay, so that's the differentiation. And again, I think once I'm able to kind of give you a few examples of nonprofits that would be considered private versus public, I think you'll have a pretty good idea of how to tell the difference between the two. Now, I talked to you a little bit a few minutes ago about the fact that trying to assess performance for governments requires something more than just the accounting information. And so part of the GASB is included in their concept statements is something called the Service Efforts and Accomplishments, or SEA. This is a concept that requires or recommends that governments collect and report certain performance information related to the activities of government. And this can be combined with accounting information. So we might be looking at something related to, say, environmental services, waste cleanup, trash collection. You know, how much does it cost to collect the trash? How efficiently do they do it? How effectively do they do it? The fire department, the police department, there'll be performance measures for all of those different organizations that will kind of roll up into this service efforts and accomplishments reporting. And governments, especially at the local level, will report separately on service efforts and accomplishments. So it's interesting. We'll talk a little bit about it. Again, with only 5 weeks to cover the material, I'm not going to be able to dive down too deeply into it, but I will show you an example of a service efforts and accomplishments report. Well, let me go back one. I want to stay on this for a minute. The minimum GAAP reporting requirements for state and local governments, okay, which are our public entities, is established by the GASB. And it includes their basic financial statements, of which there are many that are included in part of the basic financial statements, and we'll go over that in the next chapter. There's the notes to the financial statement, similar to the notes that are used in the private sector. There's the required supplementary information, again, similar to the private sector. And then there's supplementary information. So it's information that the government deems appropriate and useful to interpreting and following the financial statements of the local government or the state, and helping people to read and comprehend what's in those. And so they'll include that additional information. It's not required, but it's useful, it's helpful. Now, the way the GASB is organized is very similar to the way the FASB is organized, in that there are these general concept statements that exist. And then there's something that we call category A gap. Then there's category B gap. Both of those are authoritative groups of sources that governments can refer to when they have a question about how to account for something. And then if it's not covered in one of those two groups, then they would go to some non-authoritative sources. And you can see examples of what this refers to if you go to the book. If you should be reading along in the book here. Category A is the GASB statements themselves and their interpretations. Category B includes GASB implementation guides, technical bulletins, and literature that's issued by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants that is specifically cleared by the GASB, so they'll call specific attention to it. Some of the non-authoritative sources that governments can look to are the concept statements put out by GASB. They can also look at the FASB and the FASAB, or even the International Standards Board pronouncements that are applicable to companies overseas. And then, of course, they can look at AICPA literature that isn't specifically cleared by the GASB. And then there's other sources provided by various professional organizations, regulatory agencies, textbooks, and even published articles. And then they can also look, lastly, at, say, prevalent practices that are followed by various governments to see, hey, how is everybody handling this? There's no specific guidance, but other people are having the same issue, and so what have they done to address it? So there's kind of a hierarchy there. You first go to the authoritative guidance, and then you kind of work your way down through the non-authoritative guidance. There's a couple of tools that I'll introduce you to find or do research on the standards. You won't necessarily have access to them once you graduate. It's going to depend on who your employer is and to what extent they have accounting research materials available to you. But fortunately for us, the college, the School of Business, and the dean have been nice enough to provide us with some funds so that we can have access to the codification of the generally accepted accounting principles, similar for both government and for the private sector, the FASB and the GASB. So we'll have access to both of those. I'll provide you some login information, and I'm going to do like a little video orientation for how to use that resource, because your employer may have access to it. If you work in an accounting firm, they likely do have access to it. If you work in the private sector, they might have access to it. It just depends. And I'm not sure, governments, it depends on their budgets, whether they have access to it or not. Now, in terms of financial reporting in government, there's going to be this new concept. Before, when you had a business, you had an enterprise, an entity, a business. So, Mike's Cleaning or Dalton Bakery or something along those lines, and they would produce goods and sell them, and they'd have their income statement and their balance sheet and their statement of cash flows for their individual business. And they might classify revenues in the accounting system based on sales. They might divide up sales by product, or however their accounting system is set up and how refined it is in terms of the amount of detail. For those of you that took accounting information systems, you remember there's a lot of different ways that you can classify information in an accounting system, and that's really user dependent. The more detail you collect, the more analysis you're able to do. But again, you can go hog wild and overkill on data. So you want to only collect that data which you actually can see a present or potential future need for. In government, we're going to be talking about funds, and specifically there are 11 fund types that are used by state and local governments. they're first divided into 3 fund categories, and then secondarily, they're classified by type within the category. And so I'm going to share those with you. We have fiduciary, and fiduciary, it means it's a trust. So the handshaking there. So this is money that's being held for a purpose for somebody else. And so there's private purpose trust funds, there are investment trust funds, there's pension trust funds, and then what we call custodial. An example of a custodial would be where one government collects taxes and part of the taxes are to be remitted to somebody else. And so they've collected it, they put it into an account, and then they ultimately will transfer it to somebody else. The account that they hold it in and the way it's reported would be as a custodial fund within the fiduciary activities of the business, okay, of the government. The pension, they have employees, they offer them pensions. The money that's set aside in the pension is put in a pension trust fund. Investments, similar idea. These are investment pools that are put together for a specific purpose, and that money is invested and held off and accounted for separately. And private purpose trust funds are trust funds that are set up when somebody is providing money to the government for some specific purpose. And so the money that's provided to them is put in a private purpose trust fund. You have proprietary funds. Proprietary funds are similar to what you're used to dealing with a profit-making business. And there are 2 types. There's an enterprise fund and an internal service fund. An internal service fund would be like a print shop. So, look at Dalton State College. Dalton State College has a maintenance department. And so that maintenance department could be an internal service fund. And what it would do is it would perform services for the entire population of Dalton State College. And what they would do is they would charge the costs of the services they provide back to the branches of the college that they perform those services for. Enterprise is external. And so the enterprise is where you actually have a kind of a business that's being run by the government, and it operates generally on a profit-making business. You want to make sure that it's paying for itself and maybe even bringing in some more. And so you could be looking at airports, golf courses, all kinds of different things that will fall under enterprises. And then there's the biggest one, which is governmental. And in here we have permanent funds, debt service funds, capital project funds, special revenue funds, and general funds. And they're listed in order of specificity. And so the object of a permanent fund, when we look at these, permanent funds are funds that are set up to account for resources that are restricted to the extent that the earnings can be spent, but the principal has to be held onto. And so those are permanent funds. The principal cannot be violated. Okay. Debt service funds are funds that are set aside to pay long-term debts. So, just like a company will have a non-current or long-term liability section on their balance sheet, these debt service funds, they're the money set aside for the government to pay off the principal and interest on loans that they have for different things. Capital project funds, this is where the big assets come in. So if they acquire vehicles or equipment or construct a building or do anything like that, it's going to be accounted for through a capital project fund. A special revenue fund is when they collect revenues for some specific purpose. So like if they tax the citizens for something, what they'll be doing is they say, okay, this is not just general spending. This is for something very specific. So we're going to have levy a tax for a specific purpose. Maybe it's something related to parks and recreation or something like that. They would create a special revenue fund for that. And then general is for everything else. And so essentially that's how you kind of work through it. And so you could look at different funds, like descriptions of these things, and say, well, gee, how should we account for it? You basically would run through this list and see, okay, is it a permanent fund? If the answer is no there, then you go and look and see, is it a debt service fund? And if the answer is no, you go down and say, is it a capital projects fund? If you say no to that, goes to, is it a special revenue fund? If you say no to that, well, it has to be a general fund. And so that's kind of the way the decision tree works there. So that is those are the 11 different fund types that exist. And in the book, they have a really good presentation of this where they marry it up to a discussion of the basis of accounting. And this, again, is where one of the differences comes up between private accounting and public accounting, not like CPA firms, but public accounting for governments and public nonprofits. And so fiduciary funds use accrual accounting pretty similar to the way businesses do it that we're used to from, say, Intermediate Accounting 1 and 2. Proprietary funds, same thing. They use accrual accounting just like regular businesses do. Governmental funds, your permanent, debt service, capital projects, special revenue, and general, those funds use what we call the modified accrual. And another way to word that is used in the accounting literature is that we look at it as the accrual accounting, okay? The accrual accounting is called economic resources measurement focus. Economic resources measurement focus. For the funds that are accounted for using the modified accrual, we're looking at the current financial resources measurement focus. And the difference is that with governmental funds, you're going to capture what it cost you to do something, but it's not going to include long-term debts and long-term assets. Those are going to be captured and reported differently. And this is where we're going to get into something in the next chapter where we're going to be talking about two levels of reporting in government. There's the fund level reporting, which this is, and then there's also something called the government-wide financial statement reports. And so there's a lot of financial statements that go into the basic financial statements for a state and local government. And again, that's the last column in this spreadsheet, kind of tells you that for fiduciary funds, typically you're going to have a statement of fiduciary net position, and you're going to have a statement of changes in fiduciary net position. And so one of those is kind of like the balance sheet, and the other one is kind of like, I guess, the income statement. And then for proprietary, you're going to have the statement of net position, a statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in fund net position, and a statement of cash flows. Very similar to the way private businesses are accounted for. But again, we don't call it an income statement. We call it a statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in fund net position instead of calling it an income statement. And again, that's because the profit motive is not here. And then the statement of net position is that balance sheet that we're going to be looking at. And then the statement of cash flows looks very similar to the private sector statement of cash flows. There will be some differences, and we'll get into that as we move into the second chapter. And then for the governmental funds, under the modified accrual accounting, they're going to have a balance sheet, statement of revenues, expenditures, and changes in fund balances. Those are going to be there too. And again, the focus here is going to be on kind of the current period. So that's why they call it current financial resources. So it's kind of your revenues and expenses for the current period. And again, into one of the discussion questions is going to ask you about the difference between some terms, cost, expense, expenditure. And so we'll be talking about that a little bit to kind of give you an idea of what we mean by this whole modified accrual versus accrual accounting. For now, I just want you to know that there's a difference, and part of the difference is associated with whether it's kind of a long-term focus, the accrual accounting, or whether it's a current focus, modified accrual accounting. So to kind of wrap this up for the time being, make sure you read chapter 1, complete the reading quiz, complete the chapter homework, and write and post a response to the discussion question and the reflection question for the week. And again, the reflection question doesn't change every week. It's just, what did you find most challenging, most difficult, or most interesting? And you can kind of write up a little post about that. And again, your post for the discussion question, answer the question as completely as possible. Generally speaking, if you get beyond about a page and a half, you've probably said more than you need to for the discussion question. I would imagine the answer for the discussion question would be anywhere from a paragraph to a page and a half, depending on the complexity of the question. And then for the reflection post, a paragraph is probably plenty. Okay? So, at any rate, I've got more to say and more things to go over, but I want to try to keep these things brief so that I don't overwhelm you in one video. This is just kind of an overview of the chapter. I'll have some other materials that I'll be putting out there on more specific concepts that I want to address. So, thanks very much.